I want to say a brief something about the ending of Frankenstein by way of introducing Byron, and Byron's darkness and Byron's over-the-topness as well, because I think there's something over-the-top, I don't know, burlesque, comic, ironic about the over-the-top nihilism and darkness of the last scene. So, I mean, basically, what we have here is Frankenstein dies. They chase each other to the ends of the earth just to punish each other. And Frankenstein dies first. And the creature brags to his grave, like about how much he's suffering. So it's like a contest of who's the most disappointed and frustrated by life and miserable. That's what their rivalry boils down to, is a rivalry of resentment. My resentment is superior to thine. My agony was superior to thine. I don't know. There's something so perverse, ridiculously perverse. So I don't know. It's a mix. It's also sublime. It's it's an image of death and eternity. It's just as dark. The darkness and distance is, I feel, just as powerful as the lone and level sands that end Ozymandias, or the darkness that ends Byron's poem of that name. So, and that's, weirdly, that's its realism. I mean, that's why it feels to me like toxic masculinity, because there's also something comic about that, kind of ridiculous. In the, I don't know, the violent, over-the-top violence, just celebration of frustration in toxic masculinity. Like, they have, what's that, involuntary celibate? I mean, it's like they celebrate their resentment. In a way that seems comic, like this, but it's that also represents actual violence. Like, so that also is the realism of the novel. There's kind of a psychological realism that I feel like Hegel's master-slave dialectic also has. Hegel is sort of diagnosing the pathology of the master's own self-contempt and neediness, to have the emptiness of mastery, its utter reliance on the outside world to demonstrate what mastery means. So it's dependent on this kind of childish resistance of the world, just sort of acting out in frustration at the world, a failure to grow up in some developmental way. And so I think that's finally what the book is offering us to do. It's like, this is how you grow out of this. This is how you dissipate it, is to turn it into literature. Something we communicate about, rather than just acting out in this mechanical, reflexive way. We can acknowledge it, acknowledge this impasse. I mean, I think, what's going on here is a kind of failure to communicate, on some basic level. And I think that what the novel is a means of communicating, turning these experiences into something we can talk about, rather than just compulsively act out this inane cyclical violence. What I'm describing is the classic Aristotelian definition of tragedy. The purpose of tragedy is to purge the emotions of pity and fear. So it is kind of a cathartic release, so we don't have to act out on those emotions in real life. And I think that's, a powerful way to think about, communications, talking it out, but letting, because it's a tremendous act of social trust that we can codify our emotions and say them and trust that they're recognized. I think that's, what art is doing, is giving us a way of mediating this mutual, or social recognition. And it's it's a way of talking it out. It's kind of a blunt way to put it, but, I think part of the realism of this dialectic is, I don't know how literally it applies to so much of real life and history. So speaking of the master-slave dialectic, I think the kind of cathartic communication that I'm talking about, and irony, is really well illustrated, manifest by the blues music, the legacy of blues music, which is sort of at the root of, global pop culture today. But just, think about the basic role of irony, the singing about pain, this sort of joy of the cathartic joy of singing about pain, turning waste into value, communities of a solitude and abandonment created by the music of lamenting solitude and abandonment, in a social space of nomadic homelessness. I think that's a theme that I'm going to be developing more in this last part of the class. Is, it's a literary community, musical community. It has a kind of transportability or mobility that I think is a key part of its modern development, the kind of mobility of pop culture. That it's a worldwide language, and that is what I mean by Promethean rootlessness. It's like a global Promethean potential to for a global community. The profound ironies of blues music are part of what make it mobile, and that's what I am wanting to suggest about this romanticism, this mobility. This emphasis on failure by worldly terms. Romanticism deconstructs prevailing narratives of value and identity by working through rehearsing radical failure to fulfill those, uprooted from any particular, concrete social prestige. It's the point is precisely not to be derivative. This idea of radical bootstrapping, community created by the act of participating in it. That's what I mean by the lack of dependence. It's a performative community. think about different kinds of political action that you might have participated in there, or, you know, I think, most of us participated in having opinions about politics. You might have elaborated, position on political issues that's an intellectual or, moral commitment and argument. But then you might, I don't know, feels like a different thing, a different kind of political agency to go participate in a march or a performance of some kind, an activity of some kind. That where you get the identity from the performance. It's about a certain sense of agency that you get just from the act itself. So it's about that, the time is now. It's about putting the ideas in practice in now, in some kind of context in the present, rather than sort of being preserved as opinions rather than actions. Different dimensions. In a way, we've there's something we've lost by, I think, that's registered in language, that we think of our politics as just being opinions rather than not necessarily needing this active dimension to it. But politics is it has a practical dimension. We are what are our opinions about, but policies, practical policies. So it's I think, and not to mention today it's gotten so much harder to congregate. We've all been isolated and kind of identified with our little opinion machines, like we're kind of turning into just disembodied faces on a Zoom screen or on a phone. So that I feel like that issue of embodiment is very urgent as ever. As we go forward in this class now, I think you'll notice a dimension of the poetry that's been called sort of like sensationalism, sensational poetry. I think another word for it might be hysterical. And I think that you might reflect on your conception and experience of pop culture. Part of what I'm suggesting is that it's a medium of emotion and embodiment, communicating embodiment in a culture that's hostile to that. I mean, that's another way in which the blues is very illustrative. I want to, really explore that dimension of this literature. Gothic literature, it's sort of like genre literature. It has a cult appeal that, Byron, we're all familiar with kind of the cult of Frankenstein, or like the cultish dimension to horror. That it's not just a literary genre, that it has to do with a kind of embodied culture beyond the text. Shelley, so what I'm saying is the pop cultural dimension of horror is very much in line with Shelley's ambitions for the book. Unacknowledged legislation, creating new publics that they were motivated by these democratic ideals, and um, and informed by social conflicts, and wanting to create a more democratic reality. So, that's why I think these ideas are at stake here. It's a collective, popular culture kind of embodiment, as well as a female embodiment, in that a very prominent element of pop culture at the time, current culture, at the time of the writing of Frankenstein and Byron's Darkness, was a bizarre weather phenomenon, kind of that it was caused, although it wasn't known at the time, by a massive volcano in Indonesia, that I think was like a once in a millennia, like kind of eruption that put so much ash into the air that it changed the weather. So it's like an environmental catastrophe it was happening, and in Europe it resulted in what was called the summer without sun, and where they had record cold temperatures, and it was really dark from all the ash. So both, and that led to Shelley's details of Frankenstein. Shelley's being at staying at this place on Lake Geneva. She conceived the first thing she wrote was, it was a dark and dreary night of November or something. The introductory lines of the birth scene is inspired by the darkness of the time, as this poem is as well. So they're living in a time like ours, where they on the one hand, they are dealing with real social issues, this nihilism, this resentment, that is enacted in both these texts. The darkness is what's left in both cases by a kind of self-destruction of civilization. So they're making serious social critique, but they're also exploiting a kind of, just like cultural phenomenon, speaking. So it's very eclectic, experimental art form, combining dimensions of mythology, sort of apocalyptic fantasy, these biblical allusions, mythological allusions. So incorporating mythology, sort of a pagan ritual aspect, but also in, sophisticated, informed social critique, class critique, critique of sexism and racism, and a pop cultural dimension, like speaking to, trying to address a consumer public. This eclecticism is what, and the fact that romantic literature has all these different kind of dimensions at play, perspectives you can bring to it, make it really fun to study, I think. So let's just take a look at this last scene, which is so reminiscent, this last scene in Darkness, which is so reminiscent of the ending of Frankenstein. The final two people, even of their mutual hideousness they died, unknowing who he was upon whose brow famine had written fiend. So inane death, like um, uh, I feel like just as uh, kind of distracted and pointless, confused as the end of Frankenstein. But what I want to draw your attention to here is sort of the sublime stakes of the kind of aesthetics of the ending at the North Pole, the end of the world, and I think how he's doing something here that is typical of the aesthetics in throughout Frankenstein, of kind of aestheticizing the material, the inert material, you know, like the pieces of the creature's body, and especially the proposed mate's body, that were being similarly challenged to personify that, or our capacity to see personhood in inert materiality is being tested. Byron explicitly uses the technique of personification in the last sentence to raise that question, and I think that's it's an astonishing kind of combination of these elements, like the kind of pagan mythological element, but also sort of a modernist, like reliance on grammar, sort of to this, you know, sort of the miracle device, like this minimalist poetics of grammar, using the pronoun. You know, just like the beginning of the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, the sort of a sublime effect of it, that it is an Ancient Mariner, or, you know, the use of indexical pronouns in Tintern Abbey. I think it's interesting how they use this kind of meager means to have to address these emotions. It's another kind of irony. It's using the kind of most meager linguistic tools, just pronouns, to evoke the ineffable. There's again, that mobile irony. It's detached. It's sort of a subterfuge. Like I'm using this high-tech art, or it's kind of punk rock, like I mentioned before. Like I'm communicating to you by kind of sabotaging the tools. Or just playing with their limits in a new way. Byron uses personification to enact a kind of resurrection. So at the end of the narrative, time's done, like civilization's done, history's done, they've died, it collapsed in on itself. But so what the personification that follows, it's like, who's personifying? Who's there? It's sort of like in Kubla Khan, we're out on the waves, midway on the waves, where was heard, talking about the sound where there is no hearer, listener. This has the same uncanny effect, the personification of this void, you know, this depopulated, empty universe. So he's, you know, it's another just deep irony where he's creating a community just out of participate, or creating a reality just by imagining it. The power of the language has to do with its emptiness in a way, its absurdity, its contentlessness. And then it becomes more like music, more inviting us to experience a different kind of time just on the basis of paradoxes, not on the basis of a narrative, but how the narrative has collapsed and just turned into a kind of abstract aesthetic dance, visual game. So just notice how he can't, invites us to imagine something implicitly impossible to imagine, this timelessness. And so he's using personification to demonstrate the limits of our imagination. He's showing us you can't think that without personifying it. So it's showing the active status of our imaginations as we read, and that informs this last line. Darkness had no need of aid from them. So darkness doesn't need us. He's seriously addressing this thought of a time after us, and how it does not need us, but we can still imagine that which doesn't need us. But he's just showing us how we're doing it by personifying it. So again, just really prioritizing the active. The meaning of the poem is the saying of the poem. It's just you can't take any other lesson from it, because it the narrative does collapse in on itself, and it's just sort of the end is just like nothing. There's nothing here. Look at how little, like how much nothing. All right. The world was void. The populous and the powerful was a lump. Seasonless, herbless, treeless, manless, lifeless, a lump of death, a chaos of hard clay. The rivers, lakes, and ocean all stood still, and nothing stirred within their silent depths. Ships sailorless lay rotting on the sea, and their masts fell down piecemeal. As they dropped, they slept on the abyss without a surge. That's a first personification, and it makes you notice it, because it's like, wait, so the ship's sailorless, it would be the sailors that sleep, but this refers to the ships. They have no sailors. So as they dropped, they slept. The ships are sleeping now on the abyss without a surge. The waves were dead. The tides were in their grave. So again, he's turning it into a kind of mythology through his personific characterizations of nature as people. The moon, their mistress, had expired before. The winds were withered in the stagnant air, and the clouds perished. Darkness had no need of aid from them. She was the universe. So we have need of aid of them. She doesn't. And the she confirms our need of aid. We need the she. We need precisely the pronoun. When I say we need the she, we need the pronoun, the point is we need to read. I think the term, I mentioned Aristotelian Poetics about the idea of tragedy as a catharsis, purging, pity and fear. I think that can be misleading in that it suggests that it's dispensing with emotion. I, th- I think in the romantic literary theory that we've read sees it differently, that the emotion stays embedded in that language. Remember Shelley's description of the way language perpetuates kind of emotional content. Here's another example. I think it's a must-read in connection with Frankenstein. I mean, it's another, I think, incredibly astute version of this. What's left after the self-destruction of, inane rivalry, inane history, this legacy of inane repetition that we pass down, the nihilism, resentment. This be the verse. They fuck you up, your mom and dad. They may not mean to, but they do. They fill you with the faults they had and add some extra just for you. But they were fucked up in their turn by fools in old-style hats and coats who half the time were soppy stern and half at one another's throats. Man hands on misery to man. It deepens like a coastal shelf. Get out as early as you can and don't have any kids yourself. So yeah, just that legacy. I mean, it's a culture of, it's like what Freud called the death drive. It's a culture that's turned in on itself and, has turned self-destruction into a prestige or a value. So that's to show this kind of, it's talking about this narrative collapse that we looked at in these other self-consuming narratives. And this poem is also participating in it. Like it's fucking you up in a very direct way. Get out as early as you can and don't have any kids yourself. So, I mean, it's reminiscent of the end of Frankenstein, taking this resentment to such an absurd level. But I think that's, I mean, and it's also turning it to a joke. Like, it's funny. But above all, it's verse. It's a verse. And so it's turning this narrative of universal getting fucked up, and this nihilistic history, and turning it into a verse. Is something to sing, and which creates a new self, just like I was saying about the personification at the end of darkness. The singing itself, the verse itself, creates a new collective, a new, practical language and identity in the wake of the collapse of the history that we're singing about. And I mean, I'm talking about how, like, rehabilitating waste, rehabilitating what's left over by the in the wake of the collapse of the a former system of value. It isn't, and that has a regenerative effect. I mean, fuck it's kind of amazing how that word represents sort of both the absolute waste, the absolute worst, and procreation, sex. So, and it also sort of represents surprise. It's what you say when it's like, suddenly you're surprised by something. So it's interesting how it combines. It's the perfect word for this song because it. I mean, it's about that word in a real basic way, getting fucked up, and then it kind of, reproducing or generating, procreating a new kind of self. So that's another way of looking at Frankenstein is the procreative effect of this, or potential legacy of just reading the novel, that reading the story of self-consuming narrative. We procreate potentially a new society right out of how fucked up it is. It's these different texts are really, again, is that maybe that's a kind of a punk rock dimension to it, that they're really foregrounding their failure. And final example of grammar used to erotic effect. Here I have in mind this conjunction, so and yet. It's interesting, the poem begins as if it's merely acknowledging a case that's already made. This conclusion, so we'll go no more roving. I mean, it's a funny formulation. It's like it's a case has been made why we're not going, and therefore we are not going. It's just presenting itself. The poem is presenting itself as sort of dotting the I and crossing the T on a case that's already been made. So in a way, it underscores its own uselessness, and which makes its poetic effects all the more striking. The sort of the overwritten, so we'll go no more a roving, like it's a needlessly overwritten way to say we're not going rowing anymore. Like so the effect of this over writing, or just sort of excess writing, is itself a kind of erotic effect. So it's the poem begins by saying, therefore we're not going to do this anymore, but by the end it says, despite that, and yet, so in other words, the poem has the erotic effect of almost talking him back into going roving. But you get the same point, that it's a verse, it's a dance, it draws you into its own the momentum of the dance, even as it's telling a narrative of being through.